Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is going to be helping me out with the voiceover today, so everyone give him a warm welcome.
Number 10. The Habsburg Dynasty. The Habsburg Dynasty was one of the most successful monarchies in human history, and their success was largely because they kept it in the family. But the same thing that caused them such great prosperity would ultimately lead to their undoing. The Habsburg Empire began in the 13th century and didn't die out until 1918. One of the major contributing factors to their decline was the fact that they were so horribly messed up from incest they couldn't keep producing heirs. The dynasty began with Rudolf I of Habsburg in 1273 AD when he was elected king of the Holy Roman Empire. He appointed his sons to be the Dukes of Austria and moved the family base to Vienna. It was from their stronghold in Vienna that the house spread its authority across Europe for 650 years. The Habsburg family ruled through clever royal marriages. Extremely close relatives were married to kings and queens of other lands. This continued until most of the rulers of Europe had Habsburg blood. But with each new generation that was born came problems, and the monarchs began to look incredibly strange over time. They had sharp jaws that jutted out at an awkward angle, and it was common for Habsburgs to have a fat lower lip and a long hooked nose. Historians are careful not to call the Habsburgs ugly, but they certainly got less pleasant to look at with each new batch. One of the biggest disasters was King Charles II of Spain. Once the Habsburg family took full control of Austria, Germany, and Rome, their influence poured over into Spain. Philip I, who was a Habsburg, was married to Joan of Castile in 1496 AD. This introduced the Habsburg bloodline to Spain and tugged the nation into the family tree. 2 centuries later, King Charles II of Spain was so unhealthy from severe inbreeding that he couldn't produce an heir to the throne. Infertility saw Charles die in 1700, leaving nobody to take over the country that was related to him. Charles I had also been horribly disfigured from incest. Italian diplomat Antonio de Beatis wrote in 1517 AD that Charles I had a face like a corpse and a lopsided mouth. The Habsburg family eventually died out in Spain, and they soon faded away everywhere else as well. On August 6, 1806, the Holy Roman Empire was officially dissolved as Napoleon Bonaparte tried to lay his claim to the entire world. There were still some remnants of the incestuous family left, but their power had fallen significantly. There was still the Kingdom of Hungary and the Empire of Austria, where Habsburgs ruled. But then, in 1918, on November 11th to be exact, Charles I of Austria watched his empire collapse. This was thanks to the Germans in World War I, and with the rise of Germany, the Habsburg dynasty was hopeless. And now for number 9. But first, it's shout-out time. I wanted to give a big thank you to Firewolves for the super thanks and for supporting this channel. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos like these. Number 9. The Incestuous Mayhem on the Pitcairn Islands. The Pacific Ocean was a place of untold beauty and hidden tropical islands during the days of colonialism. Greedy sailors and ambitious pirates saw every chunk of land as an opportunity. Colonialists from the major European powers took as many islands as they could find and claimed them as their own. If the English spotted an island and they could capture it, the island soon belonged to the Queen. The locals were turned into loyal subjects, or they were obliterated if they refused to pledge their allegiance. Pitcairn Island is a small and desolate piece of land in the South Pacific that would be a good place to find yourself stranded. It was first discovered by Europeans in 1606. Portuguese sailor Fernandes de Queiroz called the group of 4 islands the Incarnation, but they were dangerous to the initial sailors that came across them. Pitcairn Island has particularly rocky coastlines that made landing extremely difficult. The island was catalogued, but nobody ever moved in because, at the time, it just didn't seem worth it. Then came something dreadful in the late 1700s. A mutiny broke out aboard a British trading ship in April of 1789. The HMS Bounty had gone to Tahiti, one of the islands favored by the English to cultivate breadfruit. They were growing the stuff on the island and then bringing the plants back to their other colonies to grow. And the HMS Bounty docked in Tahiti for 5 months while the crew prepared the breadfruit. After 5 months, the crew didn't want to leave. At least one of the crew members had married a local woman and others were undoubtedly in relationships. The crew was extremely happy to remain in Tahiti and never wanted to see the deck of a ship again. So they mutinied against the captain, and surprisingly, it was a big success. But now they were enemies of the crown. Those who didn't feel like being arrested and brought back to England fled in their ship with a small group of women they may or may not have kidnapped. There were 15 men, 11 women and 1 baby that arrived on Pitcairn Island. To turn a long and tragic story into a short one, they made a lot of babies and the gene pool was extremely limited. The initial 27 humans multiplied into 193 by 1856. Pitcairn Island was one of the most densely populated places in the area where everyone was related. But today, there are only 50 people left on the island. The population spiked though in 1937 at around 233 incestuously created people. Number 8. Mary Queen of Scots and Anne Boleyn. Mary Queen of Scots was the only child born to King James V of Scotland. She was part of the Stuart family lineage, her grandmother being Margaret Tudor, who herself was the sister of King Henry VIII. Mary had the blood of kings and queens in her veins. When James died during battle and Mary was still an infant, Mary's mother became Queen Regent. Even as a baby, Mary had the attention of European royalty. She was promised to King Edward VI of England when she became old enough, but she'd go on to marry Dauphin of France instead. At the age of 5, Mary and her maids were shipped to France where she'd wait to marry Dauphin. The marriage finally took place in 1558, and later that same year, Elizabeth I became Queen of England. Mary's mother, who was also named Mary, was also acting as Queen of Scotland while all this was going on. Mary was now the future Queen Consort of France. Her mother-in-law was Catherine de' Medici, and her sister-in-law was Elizabeth of Valois, so she was surrounded by famous European royals. When her mother died in 1560, though, things started to get troublesome. Mary, the rightful Queen of Scotland, was cousins with Elizabeth I, the only child of King Henry VIII, so Elizabeth and Mary had a lot in common. Henry's second wife was Anne Boleyn, but when Anne Boleyn failed to produce a child for Henry, he accused her of incest, adultery, and witchcraft. She was promptly beheaded following these allegations, and Elizabeth was labeled illegitimate due to the claims of incest. But the incest label didn't stick. Elizabeth still became Queen of England in 1558, and Mary became Queen of France in 1559. Mary was only 16 at the time, but then again her husband Francis was only 15. After Francis died in 1560 from an ear infection, Mary was left a widow. Charles became the new King of France even though he was only 10 years old, and Mary fled back to Scotland. Then she got into a quarrel with Queen Elizabeth that spiraled out of control, and on February 8, 1587, Mary was beheaded. All these years later, it's still unclear if Elizabeth I was a product of incest or not, but Anne Boleyn was accused of seducing her brother George and producing Elizabeth. Anne was beheaded for her alleged crime though, bringing an end to the Tudor monarchy. Maybe Elizabeth was so angry because she secretly knew her father was also her uncle. Number 7. Queen Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut, the daughter of King Thutmose I, was one of the greatest rulers of ancient Egypt. She was born sometime around 1500 BC as a princess whose fate was to marry the next king. Around the age of 12, Hatshepsut's destiny was realized when she married her brother Thutmose II. Hatshepsut was the oldest of 2 daughters born from Thutmose I and Queen Ahmes. Thutmose II inherited the throne around 1492 BC, and with his sister wife Hatshepsut, they had one daughter named Neferuri. Thutmose II died extremely young in 1479 BC, but the throne didn't pass on to his wife. Instead, his infant child, whom he'd produced with his secondary wife, became the next ruler of Egypt. Ancient Egyptian rulers were notorious for having their main wife, the official queen, and then a secondary bride and other mistresses. Historians have always wondered if Egyptian kings, who so often married their sisters, had any kind of romantic love for them, or was it all just strictly business? If marrying their siblings was just business, it would make the whole incestuous thing a lot less disturbing. In 1473 BC, there was a rather bizarre situation going on within the royal family. The king of Egypt was a baby named Thutmose III. The queen wasn't the baby's mother though, and the true mother had no right to rule because she'd been the secondary wife of the king. But the daughter of the queen and the king, Neferure, couldn't rule either because she was a girl. What made Hatshepsut such an extraordinary woman of history is that she took the unprecedented step in seizing the throne for herself. She then became the pharaoh and ruled until her mid-40s, which was a rather lengthy reign 3,500 years ago. It's not entirely known when Hatshepsut died, but it was likely around 1458 BC, and upon her death, she was buried in the Valley of the Kings. Number 6. Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great ruled Russia for over 30 years, between 1762 and 1796. She was one of the most ruthless players in European politics during the 18th century, and her enemies took every opportunity they had to slander her name. She was accused of some of the most despicable atrocities known to humanity, including bestiality and nymphomania. And as you can likely guess, one of the accusations was that Catherine participated in incestuous behavior. The thing that made the accusations hit so hard was that Catherine did notoriously participate in a lot of closed-door activities with men. Such a thing wouldn't be a big deal today, but at the end of the 1700s, it was frowned upon for a queen to be promiscuous. Historians say Catherine had at least 12 romantic relationships over the span of 44 years. Catherine knew that being married to a man would mean she'd have to give up her power, so she chose pleasure over commitment. She only came to power in the first place when she overthrew her husband, Peter III, and claimed the throne of Russia solely for herself. Surprisingly, Russia loved Catherine the Great, but members of the aristocracy felt differently. Her own son, Emperor Paul I, would eventually pass an edict forbidding any woman from ever taking the throne of Russia again. The men in power hated Catherine even after all the good she did for Russia. It's doubtful the accusations of incest were true, but they slandered her name all the same. Number 5. Lord Byron. Lord Byron wasn't part of any royal family, but he was an extraordinary English poet that was born on January 22, 1788. He was a hopeless romantic and is often considered the leading figure of early Romanticism, which was all the rage at the end of the 18th century. Romanticism was a literary movement in which artists, musicians, and writers put a big emphasis on emotion. Everything was about emotion, everything from fear to love, and Lord Byron was one of the greatest poets of them all. So his name is etched in the archives of history along with the likes of John Keats, William Blake, and Mary Shelley, many of whom were friends of Lord Byron. But Byron had a small foothold in the world of politics as well. He was a member of the House of Lords in the British Parliament from 1809 until he died in 1824. One of the nastiest rumours spread about Lord Byron during his lordship was that he secretly married his sister. The issue historians have is that Lord Byron was what you might call romantically liberated. He had at least 5 major lovers in his young life, and he was known for loving both men and women. He was accused of homosexuality in 1816, which was considered a crime at the time. And in his journal, there's evidence that Lord Byron was intently attracted to his cousin Mary Duff when he was a young boy. Then in 1816, he fled the country after becoming a little too close with his sister, Augusta Maria Lee, and up until his death, rumors continued to swirl that they were secret lovers. Why do you think incest was so popular among royal families for so long? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and while you're at it, subscribe. Number 4. Maria Theresa. Maria Theresa of Spain was a member of the Spanish part of the Habsburg family. Her father was Philip IV of Spain and her mother was Elizabeth of France, who gave birth to Maria on September 10, 1638. When Maria was just 6 years old, her mother passed away, and 2 years after that, her brother Balthazar died as well. Balthazar had originally been betrothed to his cousin, Mariana of Austria, and since Maria Theresa's father had just lost his wife and his son had lost his betrothed, the pair got married. If you've gotten a little lost, it's totally understandable. These family trees can be wildly confusing. The point is that Philip IV of Spain married the woman his own son was supposed to marry after his son died. Even though they were technically uncle and niece, they married in 1649. But for the Habsburgs, the unholy union was perfectly acceptable. Maria Theresa spent the rest of her childhood in a weird situation. Her brother and mother were gone, and her father had married his niece, Maria's own cousin. So things were strange, to say the least. Then Maria Theresa was arranged to be married to Louis XIV of France to unite the two countries. The marriage happened in 1660, but after just a few months, the king started having affairs. Maria remained faithful to the king, but that didn't stop the rumors. In the French court, there were whispers that Maria had given birth to a black baby. In truth, historians say the baby had dark purple skin because of oxygen deprivation. Maria may not have been incestuous herself, but her story is an excellent example of just how tainted the Habsburg dynasty was. Everyone around her was marrying their cousins and sleeping with their uncles. Number 3. The Colt Clan. The most tragic case of incest might not be as ancient as you'd expect. The Colt family case recently made headlines for its unbelievable horror. The family from Australia was discovered in 2012 to have been practicing incest for 4 generations, and it all started with a man named Tim Colt and his bride, June, in the 1940s. Tim and June weren't siblings, but June's parents were brother and sister. June and Tim married in 1966 and went on to have 7 kids together. They were originally from New Zealand, but they moved to Victoria, Australia in the 1970s. This was where Tim began to have relations with his own children when they got into their teen years. The family started to grow, mostly from Tim's seed, and together they formed a musical band. The Colt family grew until there were 40 of them, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and nephews, and all of them were directly related by blood. It doesn't take long for the effects of incestuous breeding to be seen. The children suffered from horrible deformities and medical problems they wouldn't have had otherwise. The kids were also said to be demented, as many of them practiced torture and mutilation in their free time. After Tim's death in 2009, the authorities began to hear stories about the inbred family living in the Australian bush, where they had no access to running water or hygiene products. With Tim dead, his daughter Betty was leading the family with her younger brother Charlie, and together the siblings had 12 children together. During the investigation, Detective Chief Inspector Peter Yeoman said it was like nothing he'd ever seen. It was so shocking that in an unprecedented move, the Children's Court in New South Wales allowed all the details of the case to be released to the public. The kids were taken away and spread out, and the older members of the family were prohibited from ever seeing them again. The Colt family is currently one of the worst cases of modern incest in the world, and it's easy to see why. Number 2. The Ptolemaic Dynasty. Ptolemy I was a childhood friend of Alexander the Great and was among the Greek king's most trusted generals. When the Great Kingdom Alexander had foraged broke into pieces after his death in 323 BC, Ptolemy took over Egypt. His children inherited the throne of Egypt after him, and their children after them, until Rome took over Egypt 275 years later. The family is known as the Ptolemaic Dynasty, and they were one of the most incestuous families in human history. All of the pharaohs of the dynasty were named Ptolemy, kind of like how the Roman emperors were referred to as Caesar. As soon as the family rose to power, the inbreeding began. Ptolemy II married his older sister, and Ptolemy III ruled alongside his cousin, Berenice II. Berenice had previously been married to the Prince of Macedonia, Demetrius the Fair, but Demetrius cheated on Berenice with his mom, so Berenice orchestrated his murder in revenge. Then she married her cousin Ptolemy III, and all this happened within the first few years of the dynasty. Ptolemy IV continued this pattern and married his older sister, Arsinoe III. Then Ptolemy VI married his sister Cleopatra II, and the trend repeated until the very last ruler of the dynasty, Cleopatra VI, the Cleopatra we all know today. Cleopatra was the last ruler of ancient Egypt between 51 and 30 BC. She ruled alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, and yes, they were married. And although it's true that Cleopatra briefly had a romantic relationship with Mark Antony, she also married another one of her brothers, Ptolemy XIV, after the other brother she wedded died. And she also had an affair with Julius Caesar, with whom she produced a son. Many historians believe Cleopatra was likely hideous rather than beautiful after almost 3 centuries of brother-on-sister action. Number 1. Elizabeth of Austria. Elizabeth of Austria was one of the few Habsburg children who wasn't born looking like they'd been beaten with an ugly stick. She was the daughter of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II and Maria of Spain, born in July of 1554. Elizabeth was described as charming, intelligent, and flawlessly beautiful. She had clear white skin and sparkling blonde hair. Surprisingly, she looked totally normal, which was bizarre because her parents were first cousins. Most of the Habsburgs, as you've come to learn today, weren't the most attractive people. There never appeared to be anything overtly wrong with Elizabeth herself, though. Her curse was that she was born into a family of demented lunatics. She married Charles IX in 1570, and shortly after, she was crowned Queen of France. But her husband didn't like her very much and spent a lot more time with his mistress. Elizabeth would go on to have only a single child, a daughter whom she named Marie Elizabeth after her own mother and Queen Elizabeth I. Then, in 1574, her husband, the king, passed away. After his death, Charles's brother Henri was proposed as a match to the widow. She declined though and soon left France because there was no more place for her there. Her father died in 1578, then her only daughter lost her life 2 years later. And in the midst of all the tragedy, Elizabeth received a proposal from her uncle, King Philip II of Spain. Elizabeth never even considered the possibility of marrying her weird king uncle, and throughout the rest of her life she remained a widow. Elizabeth later founded the convent of Poor Clare's Mary, Queen of Angels, and she lived a long solitary life until her death in January of 1592. Who is your least favorite incestuous royal from ancient history? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.